I'm here today with my colleague Katharina Piechocki, who is a great authority on Renaissance literature with a special interest in cartography. And this seems to me a really fascinating way to think about Camões, because really he is the first great poet who is living the new global experience opened out by these explorers in the period. So tell me, you see it even, I think, in the first canto. Maybe you could read that for us, get a feel of how he leads us into this new world he's discovering.
Absolutely. So Camões wrote the Lusíadas in 1572, and it really shows us the wonderful cartographic worlds that are opened up in these stanzas. And the first canto opens like this. I'm going to read it in Portuguese. As armas e os barões assinalados que da ocidental praia lusitana, por mares nunca de antes navegados, passaram ainda além de Taprobana, em perigos e guerras esforçados, mais do que prometia a força humana, entre gente remota edificaram novo reino que tanto sublimaram.
Dynamite. Maybe you could read it also for us in English.
Absolutely. The first stanza of Canto 1. Arms are my theme, and those matchless heroes who from Portugal's far western shores, by oceans where none had ventured, voyaged to Taprobana and beyond, enduring hazards and assaults such as drew on more than human prowess among far distant peoples to proclaim a new age and win undying fame.
So what's the role of geography, of mapping, in this undying fame?
Well, we have here in the fourth line, actually, the word Taprobana.
And where on earth literally is Taprobana?
Where on earth is Taprobana? So this is actually a quite interesting thing. It's a Ptolemaic toponymy, really. Camões uses really a kind of spatial imagery that is very interesting.
And this goes back thousands of years, so it's not a newly discovered thing if it's from Ptolemy.
Ptolemy is not new, of course. Ptolemy wrote a very important treatise, the Geography, around 150 Common Era, and in Alexandria, so in Greek, and he was part of the Roman Empire. However, this treatise was lost for centuries, and it was only rediscovered during the Renaissance period. Yeah. At the end of the 15th century, actually, it was brought from Byzantium to Italy, and then it became the most important, really, treatise on geography, competing with known treatises on geography.
So is Taprobana a real place? Or?
Taprobana is Ptolemy's name for either what is now known as Sri Lanka. Sometimes people identified it as Sumatra. So there is not a kind of clear idea what Taprobana is, but Taprobana was considered the world's most eastern edge and point. So when Camões says we will discover Taprobana, he really means we will sail to the end of the world, to the end of the Indian Ocean and beyond, além de Taprobana. And quite interestingly, he describes in his poem, actually, Vasco da Gama's circumnavigation of Africa and the exploration of the Indian Ocean, and Vasco da Gama's travel to India, and particularly to Calicut, which was a hub for spice trade in the 15th and 16th centuries. And there is a very interesting line here. Camões says that he will discover mares nunca de antes navegados, which means seas that had never been explored before, which is quite interesting.
So how do they use maps?
Vasco da Gama, when he was circumnavigating Africa, he used navigational charts, the so-called Portolan maps. And Portolan maps were already being used during the Middle Ages. The Catalans were among the first to use it for the Mediterranean. They're predominantly used to map out the Mediterranean Sea. However, starting with the 16th century, there is an expansion in the use of portolan charts. And Vasco da Gama and navigators used portolan charts.
And the name comes from ports.
The idea is to map out all the port cities. So you would see all the names of port cities inscribed on these maps.
And with these lines, how do you get from one to
the
the next?
rhumb lines with the wind roses. So you would have the directions. However, if you look at the interior of the continents, they're almost unexplored. And of course, sailors were not interested in the hinterland of the countries, but only in the ports. And one of the first maps really to map out the New World and also the Indian Ocean was the so-called Cantino map. It was actually a map that was designed in Portugal, and it was top secret. Cartographic knowledge was top secret. It was very well hidden. It was strategic, almost military and political knowledge that was well hidden from, of course, other countries who were competing for maritime power. And of course, trade and commerce were crucial. So Portugal had the monopoly over the spice trade, for instance, during that time. So this was a knowledge that was well hidden. Cantino map sounds Italian, and actually it was stolen from the Portuguese by an Italian guy, by an Italian spy who was working for the Duke of Ferrara, who stole the Cantino map. So now if you want to see the Cantino map, you have to go to Ferrara. The Cantino map was created in 1502, so it's very early, and it already shows the New World. It shows the Indian Ocean. It's a beautiful.
So some of Brazil knows about that.
Yes, Brazil.
Yeah.
It does not have the name America yet,
Which Waldseemüller invents.
which Waldseemüller invents together with his colleague and friend Matthias Ringmann. And Waldseemüller creates the first map that contains the word America for the South American continent, not for the North American continent. And both continents are really designed as slivers as far as they had been explored in 1507. And Waldseemüller, 9 years later, makes another map, which is a portolan chart. The 1507 map is actually a Ptolemaic map. So it is very close to Ptolemy's reading of geography, expanded, of course, to the New World. But 9 years later, in 1516, Waldseemüller creates the Carta Marina. The Carta Marina is interesting because it shows King Manuel I riding a sea monster, domesticating the Indian Ocean. And quite interestingly, we have a wonderful example of Carta Marina at the Houghton Library, which is 1513 Majolo map. We have an example of this beautiful tin container that transported the portolan.
Waterproof, because the things would bleed the colors if they got wet.
Absolutely, it's waterproof, and here is the map itself. It's a beautiful vellum map rolled together, so one would
we have the Virgin Mary, it looks like.
We have the Virgin Mary, so this map is oriented to the west, and it shows a little bit of the New World. And of course, very interestingly, Camões was competing with Spanish. So while the Spanish were discovering the New World in the west, Camões was writing about Vasco da Gama, who discovered the East, right? So the Eastern Indies, as opposed to the Western Indies. And Canto Primeiro, the first canto, actually says that we will build a novo reino, a new kingdom, a new empire in the East. The English translation here translates that as a new age. But I think that
really, it means
Novo Reino
yeah.
is much stronger and shows that there is a competition actually for dominion and expansion in the ocean.
Now, if you were to think of the Lusíadas as a kind of map of the world, a conception, how would you describe the world as it looks to this epic?
It's a fascinating question because the spatial imagery in the Lusíadas is very complex. I mentioned earlier Ptolemy, and in a way, we have already here two different sets of maps and two cartographic epistemologies, as it were. We have, on the one hand, the very practical portolan charts used by navigators who use the ports to navigate from one place to another, and the coastal line that is really very, very minutely delineated. On the other hand, we have Ptolemy, and Ptolemy is very present from stanza 1 to canto 10, where Thetis, the nymph Thetis, actually shows to Vasco da Gama what was a Ptolemaic world. And the Ptolemaic world is a world of three continents. It's a world of the oikoumene, of what the Greeks called oikoumene, namely the three continents centered around the Mediterranean Sea, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And if we look closely at the Lusíadas, we see that hardly ever does Camões reference the New World. The New World appears in Canto 10. There is a very brief reference to Tenochtitlan and a very brief reference to Magellan. However, it is really about the discovery of continents that were known to Ptolemy. So there is this cartographic imagery, and then we have yet another layer, namely the zonal map, which is a tradition that comes from Macrobius and which delineates the world and divides the world not into continents but into zones, climatic zones. So we have several references actually to the torrid zone. And interestingly, during the Renaissance, there was a tradition also to think, and during the Middle Ages, to think about the world not as divided into continents, but into inhabited and uninhabited zones. So in a way, Vasco da Gama traverses the torrid zone, what was then thought of as the torrid zone around the equator. His effort is even greater because he goes beyond very inhospitable climatic zones. So we have a conflation of all these spatial and cartographic images and
ecological sort of imagination,
and also ecological imagination.
Even so, the sort of storminess of the southern tip of Africa and Adamastor. This is also about the kind of fierceness of this part of the world that he's able to go through.
Absolutely, and of course, it is a fantasy also. It is a fantasy of discovery, because while Camões says that these seas had never been explored before,
of course they had been.
Vasco da Gama is the first one, and the Portuguese sailor is the first one. Actually, Vasco da Gama sails across oceans that are full with people. There are Arab merchants. There were a lot of Chinese.
And he needs guides, right? He gets guidance from people who know these areas perfectly well.
Absolutely. He needs guides whom he finds in Africa and Malindi, translators, and people who are familiar with the Indian Ocean. So it is a fantasy that Camões proposes here, the fantasy that Europeans actually explore these parts of the world. And it is a fantasy that had very strong implications because it established a myth that actually the Renaissance is a European invention and that the Europeans were the first explorers of the world. So it is a global epic, and yet it is at the same time maybe the first global myth-producing epic and the first European global fantasy, a fantasy of empire. And it is also a cautionary tale. If we think of Adamastor, the monster Adamastor is really a retired sailor. He says, I was Lord of the Seas. And look what has become of me. And the epic ends with Thetis explaining the future deeds to Vasco da Gama, how many battles there will be, how many blood will be shed to uphold the empire.
as already at the beginning of the voyage, the old man of Belém essentially says, watch out for what you're getting into.
Yes, the so-called old man of Restelo or of Belém says that, you shouldn't do that. The sea is a dangerous endeavor. Just don't try to go beyond your human force and your human boundaries. So a lot of critics have thought that maybe Camões is actually expressing his own opinion.
On the other hand, he seems to be urging the king to go and conquer Africa.
Yes.
How do you put these two things together?
Well, the complexity of this poem is really that Camões writes at a time when the Portuguese Empire was not at its height anymore. The events that Camões describes took place in the very last years of the 15th century. Camões published this and wrote this poem in the 60s. It was published in 1572. So a lot of time has elapsed and a lot of things have happened. And there is a fierce competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish for dominion and for presence and influence across continents and seas. And if one reads the Lusíadas carefully, one notices also an anti-Castilian undertone. And very interestingly, the year Camões died in 1580, the Portuguese lost their autonomy. The Portuguese Empire was taken up by the Spanish Empire and incorporated into the Habsburg Empire under Philip II's rule. So very interestingly, while Camões sings about the prowesses and exploits of the Portuguese heroes, he was writing in a time when everything was really going downhill.
And partly because of the disastrous expedition of King Sebastian to North Africa, right?
Yes.
So many of the nobility are slaughtered or sold off into slavery.
Yes, this is correct. King Sebastian has remained a very tragic figure in the Portuguese imaginary, really. He was a king who became king at the age of 3. He died at the age of 24. And the poem is dedicated to King Sebastian, who died 4 years after the publication of the poem in the Battle of Alcázar-Quibir.
Trying to conquer this, to increase this reign.
To increase the Portuguese realm of influence. And he dies and leaves Portugal without heir. And this is the moment when Portugal becomes part of Spain.
So now this celebration of a national empire that's teetering on the edge of absorption, what happens to this epic after Camões dies and it starts to itself move out into the world?
It's fascinating to think that the year that Portugal became Spanish, there were 2 translations of the Lusíadas into Spanish. So what we think of as being a canonical Portuguese national epic becomes this transportable commodity used for all different purposes.
Really almost a little pocketbook.
It's a little pocketbook that is beautifully made. We have, of course, the golden rim that prevents dust from destroying the pages. And this is one of the translations by Luís Gomes de Tapia, who translated not only the Lusíadas into Spanish, but he also had other people work on magnifying the importance of the work. And we have here, for instance, the first published text by Góngora. So major Spanish poets. So there is an attempt to make Camões Spanish. And why? I think the work itself gave the Spanish the possibility to think of it as a marker of the translation of empires. So while the Portuguese had their major expansion at the beginning of the 16th century, Vasco da Gama, India, the spice trade, toward the end of the century, it's really Spain that takes up and that incorporates Portugal under a united global empire.
So it's partly a way of co-opting this power they've just absorbed and building on it. And you have this wonderful sense of the double meaning of translatio, right? Literally moving from one place to another, moving the empire and translating the empire literally in this form.
Exactly. And it lends itself wonderfully for that, because at the end of the poem, Camões mentions Tenochtitlan and the circumnavigation of the globe. So he references the New World. So it was easy, actually, for the Spanish to think about this poem as leading to this incorporated Spanish expansion.
And on the one hand, you have the tiny pocketbook that you could take on your voyages. Then you have the massive edition, the coffee table book. Now coffee is newly becoming important. You can have a coffee table.
You can have a coffee table.
And you can have this. So what do you get when you have this big deluxe edition?
Well, this is a fascinating book. We are very lucky to have these books. They are very unique. This is a 2-volume annotated version of the Lusíadas by a Spanish writer whose name is Manuel de Faria y Sousa. He published the annotated Lusíadas in 1639 in Madrid. In a way, this is an explanation how to read the Lusíadas for the Spanish public. And this is a massive, this is a scholarly...
Bound in vellum, again, almost like those porcelain maps.
Absolutely, bound in vellum.
And so you have this gorgeous sort of, and again, very elaborate title page.
With the arms of Portugal.
Oh, this is Portugal.
This is Portugal, yes. So this is
but with royal privilege in Madrid, it's telling you.
Royal privilege in Madrid, but these are the arms of Portugal with actually Christ's wounds, the 5 chagas, as they're called.
And dedicated to the Spanish king, Philip the Great.
To the Spanish King Philip IV, El Grande. This is very interesting because it was published in 1639. In the year before Portugal regained its autonomy and became Portugal again, when we have the restoration of the empire. If one travels today to Lisbon, there is a very great big boulevard called Avenida dos Restauradores, and the Restauradores are the restorators of 1640 of the empire. So this came just immediately before. We do have the manuscript of Manuel Faria de Sousa, which is a fascinating book. It was written in 1622, and we might assume that it's an autograph, that this is an autograph copy by Manuel Faria de Sousa. Here, beautifully illustrated. It says, segundo borrador, so it's the second draft. Even for a draft, people took the time to really wonderfully illustrate it. And we see Faria de Sousa's work on the Lusíadas. It's wonderful to see which paragraphs he included, that he actually compares here. We can't see that very well, Camões to Virgil. He calls Camões the second Virgil, and we see that Camões becomes a transportable poet. Here in Portuguese, the comments are in Portuguese, but then they were translated into Spanish. So this wonderful, wonderful manuscript belonged actually to John Betterson Stetson, the inventor of the cowboy hat.
Interesting.
And I don't know what he did with it. Then Houghton Library purchased this manuscript, and we see his reflection upon every single stanza of the poem. And very interestingly, it also includes here at the end, published poetry by Camões. We have an
So it's
annotated, cut and
printed
pasted
text.
poetry that had already been printed. So we have Camões's Redondilhas, which is a Portuguese and Spanish poetic form, pasted into it with the comments by Faria Sousa, who makes clear that Camões is an epic poet, but he's foremost a poet. He's a great poet. The Spanish appropriated Camões for their own imperial purposes almost immediately after the death of Camões. And when we now go to Lisbon again, we see everywhere references to Camões. There's a Praça Camões with a big statue of Camões. Camões is considered a national poet.
Did he move his bones or someone's bones, they say, are his parallel to Vasco da Gama, right?
Yes,
so the two are there together.
The two are there. But it all happens in the 19th century. So Camões, as this Portuguese national poet, is a 19th century invention. So we have Teófilo Braga, who actually is a 19th century poet who helped with the commemoration of Camões in 1880 to celebrate the 300 years of his death and to transport the bones and the to Jerónimos. But between the death of Camões in the late 16th century to the 19th century, Camões is being translated and appropriated by different countries
English as
and
well.
empires. So after becoming Spanish, Camões also becomes English. And we have a translation actually by Richard Fanshawe, which is the first translation into English of Camões in 1655 to celebrate the rise, really, of Britain's rising empire. And we have a second translation of 1776 by William Mickle, who dedicated the translation actually to the shareholders of the East India Company.
Oh, interesting.
So we see how important this work becomes in a global context and
what a
how
difference
it is
that the early dedications are like to the king, now it's to the company, right?
to the company, yes.
That's fabulous.
Yes, and we do have actually Mickle's translation here.
Yeah. Now this is really interesting because I see in the opening pages it's dedicated to a member of the nobility, but then there's also this long list of subscribers, dozens of people.
Yes.
And what's the function of having subscribers now?
Well, the Lusíadas here become a poem of commerce and of trade. And we have, as you said before, first an interaction with the king, and now we have an interaction with a wide web of people whose interest lies in commerce. And we have a wonderful, wonderful sentence here in the introduction. Mickle says, "In contradistinction to the Iliad and Aeneid, the Paradise Lost has been called the epic poem of religion. In the same manner, may the Lusíad be named the epic poem of commerce."
That's really great.
Yes. So it changes not only language, but it changes also its function. So there is a translatio going on there as well, from a political to a commercial to an economic realm and domain.
And this is a very English kind of take on it.
Yes.
In fact, Voltaire later, when he's talking about English epics and about English society, when he's in England, he will say, well, other empires have proceeded militarily, whereas England brilliantly proceeds commercially, and from that they get their navy and their empire.
Yes.
So we
yes.
see this very much, this commercial project.
Yes, it is a commercial project. By the way, Mickle also translated Voltaire, Voltaire's Iliad. So we have a close relationship between Voltaire and Mickle. This was only possible. England's rise in terms of economy was only possible after the defeat of the Spanish Armada also. And that marks, in a way, the translations and the years of the translations. If we think about the first translation from the Portuguese into Spanish, 1580, that is 8 years before the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And the first English translation follows in 1655 in a very different political but also economic setting.
Well, this is quite fascinating how this whole history of translation, of translatio, and of the movement from exploration to empire to commerce shows the epic being reinvented by each generation. Maybe in conclusion, what would you say it's like for you reading this now in the 21st century?
Traditional Portuguese scholarship tends to read it as a monument of what the Portuguese call descobrimentos, the discoveries, the age of discoveries. And there are a lot of critiques, actually, to that project. And there are scholars who now read, actually, Camões' epic as a criticism of empire and say that what we see here is actually an irony of Portugal's imperial endeavors. So I think that I tend to read it on both levels. At the tension between Camões' enthusiasm for this new global commercial spaces and political spaces that emerged, and also as a critique of empire.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.